My sister-in-law opened bank credit lines in my name for 5 years, accumulated massive debts using my identity. And when I discovered it, the whole family defended her. But they didn't know I am a banking risk analyst and traced every single operation down to the last cent. There are moments when the floor shifts beneath your feet without anyone else feeling it. You're standing in the same place as always. The same walls, the same faces, the same kitchen where your mother-in-law makes coffee on Sundays, and where your husband sits down to read the newspaper, and where your sister-in-law always arrives late with a smile that now, looking back, I understand in a completely different way than I understood it before. The floor shifted for me on a Wednesday afternoon when I opened a letter from a bank. It was not my bank. It was a bank where I had never opened an account. And the letter was a delinquency notice on a personal credit line in my name for an amount that represented more than I earned in a year. A credit line I had never applied for, at a bank where I had never set foot, with my name, with my ID number, with my signature. My name is Renata. I am 36 years old. I am a senior credit risk analyst at a banking institution, which means I spend my days evaluating credit applications, detecting fraud patterns, identifying operations that don't match the real profile of the applicant, and building the models that banks use to decide who they lend to and who they don't. It is a job that teaches you something most people don't know, that banking identity fraud leaves specific, technical, traceable marks that for someone trained to look for them are as visible as a signature in red ink on white paper. What I did not expect was needing that skill to trace operations made in my own name. But as someone who sat at my same family table every Sunday. I married Tomas 7 years ago. Tomas has a large and close-knit family. One of those families where everything is celebrated together and everything is resolved together, and where family loyalty is a value that is mentioned frequently and with genuine conviction. His younger sister's name is Valeria. She is 31 years old, works in sales, has a lifestyle that always seemed broader than her salary should allow, but to which no one in the family gave too much importance because Valeria had always been that way, had always found a way to have what she wanted, and in the family narrative that was interpreted as resourcefulness and not as a warning sign. Valeria and I were never close. There was no specific reason. We were simply very different people with ways of seeing the world that didn't find many points of contact. We got along on the surface, with the functional cordiality that is built in families by marriage when there is no natural chemistry, but there is willingness to coexist. What I did not know was that that surface cordiality had given her access to something she should never have had. When the first bank letter arrived, I started searching in the methodical way, which is the only way I know how to search. I requested my complete credit reports from all available agencies. What I found took several minutes to settle as real information rather than as error. There were 5 active credit lines in my name at 4 different banking institutions. 5 credit lines I had never applied for, with balances that when added together amounted to a figure that when I saw it in total made me close my eyes for a few seconds before continuing to read. The oldest had been opened 5 years ago. 5 years of credit operations in my name without my knowledge. 5 years of someone using my identity to access money that they then didn't pay or paid irregularly, building a delinquency history that was now in my name, and that if I didn't resolve, it was going to affect my ability to obtain any kind of credit for years. I spent the next 3 days doing what I do at work when I'm assigned an identity fraud case. I built the complete file. I requested from each banking institution the documentation of the credit applications, the forms, the copies of identification presented, the signatures, the proof of address used, the contact phone numbers registered. I had the legal right to that information as the holder of the credit lines, even though someone else had opened them. What I received over the following days was revealing in a way I technically expected and was emotionally not prepared to process. The copies of identification presented were scans of my ID card, scans that someone with access to my physical or digital documents had obtained and used. The signatures on the forms were imitations of mine. Not perfect, but similar enough to pass the basic verification controls that banks apply in in-person applications for lower amounts. The proof of address documents had my real address, but with subtle alterations in dates or references that made them modified documents. And the contact phone numbers registered in all the applications were different from mine, but followed a pattern I recognized when I saw them together. They were numbers with area code from the same geographic zone where Valeria lived. I said nothing to Tomas yet. I know how that might sound. I know the expected reaction would be to rush and tell your husband. But I knew Tomas and I knew his family well enough to know that if I arrived with an accusation without complete evidence, the most likely result was a family confrontation that would destroy the evidence and leave me in a much weaker position than I had. I needed the complete file before having that conversation. I kept building. I reviewed the credit statements to trace what the money had been spent on. In risk analysis, this is called fund disposition tracing, and it is a standard technique for understanding the usage pattern behind a fraudulent credit line. The money from the credit lines had been used primarily on purchases at clothing stores, travel, restaurants, and electronics. The geographic pattern of the purchases was concentrated in the area where Valeria lived and in travel destinations that matched trips Valeria had posted on her social media with dates I was able to cross-reference with the transactions. The photos of Valeria on her social media, showing her new clothes, her trips, her dinners, had dates that matched the transactions on the credit lines in my name with a precision that was not coincidence. It was a map, and the map pointed to one place. I called my attorney when the file was complete. Attorney Adriana Fuentes has spent 14 years in banking law and financial crimes. I met her professionally years ago, and her work generates in me a trust based on real evidence of her competence, which is the only kind of trust that seems solid to me. She listened to me for 50 minutes. At the end, she told me that what I had was a case of banking identity fraud and improper use of documents with evidence that qualified as exceptional in terms of completeness and traceability. She explained the available actions: a criminal complaint for identity fraud and use of forged documents, a request for cancellation of the fraudulent credit lines at each banking institution with supporting documentation, and repair of the credit history through the formal identity clarification process. She asked me if I had any idea who had done it. I told her yes. I told her who. There was a pause. She told me that complicated things in a specific way, but did not change the strength of the case. It only changed the family dynamic that would come afterward. She was right about that. The conversation with Tomas was on a Sunday night. I waited until we were alone. I placed a file on the table. I walked him through the documentation using the same methodology I would use to present a case at work. First the facts, then the evidence, then the conclusions that follow logically from that evidence. Tomas did not speak for a long time while he reviewed the documents. When he spoke, the first thing he said was that there had to be an error. I told him I understood that reaction, that I had also wanted there to be an error when I started investigating. That is why I had built the file the way I had, so that the evidence would speak for itself and not depend on my interpretation, but on the documented facts. I showed him the social media photos of Valeria crossed with the transaction dates. Tomas was silent for much longer the second time. The family conversation that followed was the hardest part of the entire process. Not because of the confrontation with Valeria, which when the evidence is sufficiently clear tends to be briefer than you expect, but because of the reaction of the rest of the family. My mother-in-law cried. She said Valeria had made a mistake, but that she was her daughter and the family needed to resolve this internally. My father-in-law said that taking this to the authorities would destroy Valeria, and that couldn't be what I wanted if I truly loved his son. Two sisters-in-law said I was exaggerating, that there was probably an explanation, that maybe I didn't remember having given permission for something. That I didn't remember having given permission. 4 or 5 credit lines at 4 banks over 5 years. I let it go, not because it didn't hurt, but because I knew that no argument in that moment was going to change what the evidence said, and because the decision of what to do with that evidence was already made. The criminal complaint was filed 1 week later. Valeria was summoned to testify. She arrived with an attorney her parents had paid for, a man who had clearly advised her to deny everything in the first instance. She denied everything in the first instance, until the prosecutor presented the banking documentation, the modified identification copies, the analysis of coincidence between the transactions and her social media activity, and the handwriting analysis that determined the signatures on the bank forms were imitations made by the same person. Sustained denial in the face of evidence of that level has a technical name in procedural law. It is called an untenable position. The criminal process resulted in a conviction for identity fraud and document falsification. The sentence was 4 years of imprisonment with the possibility of suspension under strict conditions that included payment of damages calculated on the total amount of the fraudulent credit lines. Each banking institution canceled the fraudulent credit lines from my history after receiving the documentation from the criminal process and my formal clarification requests. My credit history was fully repaired. Tomas and I are still married. It was not an easy path. There were months when the weight of what had happened between his family and me was so heavy that neither of us knew well how to carry it. We went to therapy, first separately and then together, and that helped in ways I could not have anticipated. Tomas made the decision to distance himself significantly from his family during the legal process and the months that followed. He didn't break the bond completely because he is not the type of person who does that, but he established boundaries that didn't exist before and that I think we both know are permanent. The relationship with the in-laws and sisters-in-law is distant. There is no active hostility, but also no longer the warmth that perhaps existed before. Though now I wonder how much of that warmth was real and how much was the surface of something I wasn't seeing. That question has no satisfying answer. What does have an answer is what I want you to take from this story. Identity fraud doesn't always come from strangers. Sometimes it comes from people who know your address, who have seen your documents, who know your ID number because they once read it over your shoulder or saw it on a family form. The real protection is not generalized distrust toward everyone around you. It is the active monitoring of your own financial identity. It is reviewing your credit reports regularly. It is setting up banking alerts that notify you of any operation in your name. It is knowing that you have the legal right to that information and exercising that right. Your financial identity is yours. No one has the right to use it, and if someone does, there's a process to prove it, and there are real consequences for whoever did it. There always are. If this story left you speechless, comment. Do you check your credit history regularly? Like if you believe protecting your financial identity is your own responsibility. Subscribe for more real stories. Share with someone who needs to know they can monitor their financial identity. Practical tip: review your credit report at least twice a year at all available agencies in your country. Set up alerts on your bank accounts for any operation. If you find credit lines or transactions you don't recognize, act immediately. You have the legal right to request the complete documentation of any credit line in your name and to initiate a formal clarification process.